The very survival of the nation is at stake. Nigeria is on the brink of a looming collapse. Those are not my words. They are the words of Catholic bishops while reacting to the worsening security situation and violence across the country. Welcome to People, Politics and Power. I am Imoni Amarere. The Catholic bishops are not alone in their assessment of the situation in Nigeria today. Nobel laureate Professor Wole Soyinka, speaking on the incessant abduction of students in various boarding schools across Nigeria, says the country is close to the stage of accepting the unacceptable culture. The abduction of 317 schoolgirls from Jangebe, a community in Zamfara State, is the latest in a long list of disturbing situations in the country. Professor Soyinka is particularly worried by the irreparable damage being done to the nation's collective psyche in the long run. From north to south, it would appear that the country has been overwhelmed with all sorts of issues. Security remains a very serious challenge with its many manifestations: banditry, farmers, herders clashes, abductions, kidnappings, armed robbery, and other sundry crimes. One other area often overlooked is the economy that has just made a quick return from the recession, but faces serious challenges on its part. Structural issues also dominate discourse, and a lack of harmony on how to proceed. With calls for restructuring still divisive, a group, the National Consultative Front, is currently drafting what it describes as a new constitution for Nigeria. Issues of national unity, ethnic intolerance, and mutual distrust remain sources of concern for many, and a drawback towards achieving one nation with a shared vision and goal. Indeed, some citizens seem to have given up on the country's unity because of government's inability to address growing cases of ethno-religious bigotry that threaten the nation. Poor leadership and bad governance have also left the people disillusioned and seeking for a messiah. Many Nigerians cite the absence of the rule of law, the rise of impunity, and rampant corruption as issues that must be addressed if the nation is to make progress. Well, on this edition of the program, we shall x-ray the state of the Nigerian nation and suggest ways to move in the right direction. What is the role of state institutions, non-state actors, and individuals in helping to pull the state away from a looming anarchy and from the brink? My guest is a political scientist, an intellectual of repute, a civil society activist, the immediate past country director of Plan International, and the new country director of CARE International, Dr. Hussaini Abdu. Stay with us and be with him in a moment. Right, our guest once again, Dr. Hussaini Abdu, is a country director of CARE International, a political scientist, a civil society activist, and an intellectual of repute. Dr. Hussaini Abdu, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much.
Welcome. There is no doubt in my mind that Nigeria is facing one of its biggest challenges as a nation currently.
Absolutely.
So what would you say is the nature of that challenge?
It's a very deep-seated challenge, and sometimes diagnosing it can be quite difficult, particularly for a country like ours that we have always struggled with the politics of ethno-religion and regional divisions. and sometimes to have a very robust or concrete understanding of what is happening sometimes proves difficult because it gets muddled into the politics of the country, and therefore understanding those realities becomes extremely difficult. But there's no doubt that as a country, we are faced with one of the most challenging moments of our history. You just did a very apt description of some of those challenges, whether you call social-economic one, the political one, the security situation. It's deep. It's really, really deep-seated. But none is independent of the other. They are mutually reinforcing. So if you just pick one, you can actually understand the relationship between that and the other one. Take security, for instance. It's been something that we have been struggling with for the past 11 to 12 years. Initially, because there are different manifestations of it across our recent history, from what we had in Boko Haram violence in the northeast of the country that we are still grappling with 11 years since the beginning of that crisis. We are seeing a very different manifestation in the northwest of the country. Of course, we talk about banditry, but there are different manifestations of violence around those areas. The banditry, there's a whole issue around cattle rustling. There's an issue around ethno-religious violence in some part of the northwest. You have a different manifestation in the north central, sometimes bordering around herders, farmers violence. We are seeing a different manifestation in the southwest of the country, where you also have relatively more like remnants of some of those bandit issues around certain locations in the southwest. Oftentimes, the media is very quick to describe it as herders, farmers kind of conflict, but to a very large extent, there are pockets of other bandits from the northwest who have found bases in certain forest locations within the southwest. You could see some element in the southeast, and so it's quite deep. And you can practically say today that there is no part of this country that you can actually say that it's safe. Our highways have become totally unsafe, and people have to look for other means of traveling. That has strong toll on the economy, particularly the local economy, where people produce for either subsistence or for small-scale sales. So we've seen how that has significantly impacted on food production in the northwest of the country, particularly in the axis of Zamfara, Katsina, some northern part of Niger, and the eastern part of Kaduna State, where food production has significantly dropped, particularly by because in those axes, smallholder farmers that are actually farming, they use that for subsistence, and they also sell from. Commercial farmers have also been deeply affected by that situation, and that has implication for food and food poverty in the country at the moment. So rising cost of foodstuffs and all that. We may be talking about recession and all that. And for me, I've always argued, anytime the country is in recession and Nigerians go here out and say, oh, this economy is in recession, I go quick to remind people that you will soon be out of this recession and there wouldn't be any significant change in your social economic condition. Because the reality actually around growth economics is that using the GDP growth to measure the health of the economy is actually not enough, because it doesn't measure the reality of the social economic conditions of the people. And that's the difference between that kind of GDP-based kind of assessment and human development indexing. Because in the human development concepts, you're actually looking at people, not an abstract formation that you actually call economy, and that sometimes may not have direct bearings with the realities of the people. So it is easy for just, okay, you have a GDP growth of just a few digits, and then everybody say we are out of recession. but there is no significant difference in the conditions of the people. Jobs have not expanded in any way. People's income has not increased in any way. Inflation has not dropped in any significant way. People's access to food and different levels of calories expected for them to grow is not reflecting in any way. Education, enrollment, and complexion has not changed. People's access to health services and all that has not changed because it doesn't measure that. And that is why many times people say, oh, why are you saying we are out of recession when we are still feeling this way? It's because...
So the people are in perpetual recession?
Yeah, because the truth about it is that people are in perpetual recession, but what we are using to measure the health of our economy does not speak to the realities of the citizens or of the people. And that's just the concern. And for me, what I always say in this kind of conversation is that the economy is good, the GDP growth is very important, but again, the human development indicators are actually more important. And therefore, where you're not judicially in one, how are you striking that balance? Because in our own context, what happens is the government goes hysteric and a panic mode when you're in recession, because recession is a strong political concept. It's economic in narration, but it's a very good political tool. Either on the other side who is opposing could actually use that, and then they struggle, and then you get some few digits of growth, and you say, oh, we have pulled the economy out of recession. Also, another very good political instrument, and then you flag that up at all time, and then the realities of the people didn't change in any way. And so that's a very important issue that Nigeria needs to understand, and that our government and people managing the economy need to actually understand. How are we connecting this? And what is the relationship with our Human Development Index and the crisis of insecurity that we're experiencing? Of course, we don't sometimes, when we begin to associate this violence and all that with the crisis of human development, sometimes people think you are making excuses. Crime is crime, no doubt about it. And no amount of poverty should, for instance, push anybody to the level of the kind of carnage that we are experiencing in the country. But that's a reality. There is a relationship between the social economic development and crime. And it's given that you cannot be in a kind of situation and actually expect to live in a very secured environment. And that's what we are saying at all times. People who are in their comfort zone, who are comfortable, upper class, middle class, and all that, senior politicians, that sometimes you do certain things for your own self-enlightening interest, that you recognize that if I don't respond to this, I could be consumed by this crisis. So with the spate of kidnapping across the country, people are not traveling. When you travel, you have to go by air and all those things because you are afraid. You go to your village, you don't actually know who is coming to knock at your door. We have seen politicians, senior ones, actually kidnapped. We've seen professors kidnapped. So we've seen different caliber of people being kidnapped, and some actually dying in the course of that. And then we are seeing this escalating trend of mass adoption. That people we like to refer to as kidnapping. And I think once you begin to do one thing very frequently, it loses its shock factor. It loses that shock factor. You begin to create a new normal, and probably maybe that's what Professor Wole Soyinka was trying to refer to, accepting an unacceptable culture. So not shocking. The reaction, for instance, to the kidnap in Jangabi, for instance, was very, very different from what you had in Chibok. Chibok was the first case, and the whole country and the world actually was shocked.
Very shocked.
The whole world was shocked.
And to imagine that there were the 276 of them in Chibok.
Yes.
But here we're talking about 317 small children.
Absolutely. So check around that. And in fact, even with the age factor, the Chibok girls are even much more older than the kind of girls you have here. And the number is much more higher than you had in Chibok. But feel it, the kind of shock we experience then, we're not feeling that now. Because 2 weeks earlier, you had a case in Kagara. And then a month or two earlier, you had in Kankara. You know, a few years back, you had in Dapchi. So with that kind of situation, the shock factor has been lost. And this is how new normal is created. That that level of crime is no longer, unfortunately, to say, it's no longer shocking. It's no longer shocking people the way it should be. And so once you get to that stage, you are normalizing what shouldn't in any way actually be normal.
Normalizing the abnormal.
Yeah.
Are we losing our humanity in that process?
Absolutely losing our humanity. But you see, one terrible character of humanity is also that adaptability, that it could adapt to even the worst situation. And that's the kind of problem, the kind of situation we're seeing. And reactions are different, attitudes to this issue, very lackadaisical. Governors quickly, panically closing schools. Yes, of course, it's irresponsible to keep schools that are actually on the fringes of some of these forests or enclaves of these bandits, some of those ungoverned spaces. Keeping boarding schools on in those spaces was totally irresponsible. And of course, but when you close such schools, you don't close such schools without making adequate arrangement for absorption of these children in different schools across the state. If there are available boarding schools in more secure areas, you take them to those boarding schools. And if there are no available boarding schools, you get them to go to day schools in their own community, but you don't close down schools without making corresponding arrangement for continual learning of these children. And that's the whole essence of the Safe School initiatives, that children are able to learn under safe environment. We saw that, we did that with even with Chibok girls. We did that even with federal government colleges in the Northeast at a point when it was becoming unsafe. We moved them across to different other federal government colleges to ensure that they are able to continue their education. So I think my worry, Mark, and I hope I'm wrong, is that the government at all levels, except probably a few, does not seems to understand what we are dealing with. And I hope I am wrong here. But from what I see, from the reaction that I see, from the statement that I hear from senior public officials, it doesn't give me the impression that we actually understand what we are dealing with. You see, it's a different thing if you understand it and then you are struggling to find solution to it. Because understanding it is just the first stage to the solution. So if you don't understand the challenges you are dealing with, which is fundamentally around the challenges of crisis of governance and collapse of communities. And I don't hear the language of communities collapsing. In some of those areas that have transformed into enclaves of bandits or banditry, is a case of communities have collapsed. The state has failed, that is given, in the sense that it has failed to provide for its citizens in those areas. But the crisis point is the fact that because when state collapse, what keeps people is the sense of community. But when there is a corresponding collapse in community, you're actually dealing with a massive crisis. And that's what you have. What are the basic things? Community is a glue. It's a glue that keeps people together. And some of those basic things is about self-management, where you are doing something wrong, community members are able to say, what you are doing is not okay, and we are not going to allow you to continue doing this. And they come with different forms of sanctions and executions, whether you are talking about the institution of religion, or you are talking about the institution of culture, including its own political system, or you are talking about the institution of the family, or you are talking about institution of trade and trade relations within communities. These are glues that hold communities together, and they actually help it doesn't mean that they eliminate crime, but they help in managing crime. But when a whole community transformed into banditry, when a whole community becomes so helpless in face of banditry, then you are dealing with a major crisis, and it's a community failure as with a corresponding state failure. It's deeper, because when state fails to provide, people coalesce, they work together, create and strengthen a state of community, and even begin to self-provide, and begin to act, despite or in spite of state failure. They still keep a sense of community. But when you have state failure in locations, because we are actually talking about locational state failure, Nigeria does not fall into that total classic collapsed formations that we are talking about. But the same way you have locational failure, you also could probably have locational or pockets of enhanced state presence in certain states. In certain states, you may find government doing okay, but in other states, you actually have almost like a state of total collapse. So I wish we have this strong understanding. Our narratives will not simply be around ethnic or religion or regional thing that we have, but naturally, this is also what happened in politics like our own. When you are faced with crisis, you quickly fall into those fault lines for explanation.
There is another big concern arising from this is your very in-depth analysis of the situation.
Yeah.
When communities collapse, as they are now, there is a tendency for certain individuals or certain groups, or indeed even certain communities who have not experienced a total collapse, to resort to self-help. Let's look at the relationship between banditry and education, for instance. In the last 7 years, there have been at least 1,157 abductions of school children abducted from schools, from Chibok to Dapchi to Kankara to Mahuta, to Kagara, and now to Jangebe. I mean, we have had them like that from 2015 up to 2021, the last 7 years. And in these places, in Jangebe, for instance, the last situation that we have on our hand now, we understand that when this happened and when security forces moved in, the community revolted. I mean, parents of these children were so incensed that they wouldn't even allow journalists or security men to get into those communities. When situations like that arise and people begin to take laws into their hands, when they begin to, what the Minister of Defense want to say, do self-defense, protect yourselves, and all of that. What does that mean to the state? What does that mean to governance?
Yeah. You see, there's always implication when governance fails. And the axis where this bandit operates, we generally classify them as some of those ungoverned spaces. And ungoverned spaces, meaning that they are not conventionally governed. Because, in the sense that there is no sign, no semblance of the state, either in terms of services or in terms of broadcast of authority. Authority is not being broadcasted there. But there has been alternative state structure emerging in those areas, largely also led by the bandit himself, who actually collect tax, who determines who goes to farm and who does not go to farm. So they are broadcasting authority from their own side, not the formal state authority. So when you have that, self-help comes to it, like the incident you're trying to describe. The reaction was informed by the fact that they begin to see the security institutions and agencies as inefficient, as incapable of protecting them. And their feeling was that they would prefer their vigilantes to go, and that the coming of the military is going to slow them down. And so they want to go, the self-help that you're referring to, they want to go there and get it out. And this has been the major driving factor of the violence in the Zamparagas and axis, because it's violence and counter-violence. This has been going on for over a decade. The crisis in that area has been going on for over a decade. That one, it was an unreported crisis for a long while, and then when we began to report it, we explained it differently. So the reporting of it initially was, at a point we were actually referring to as bucket of Boko Haram. And then another point we were largely looking at it from farmer herders' perspective. On another breath, people look at it from cattle rustling. And in fact, there were even people who also look at it from ethnic Fulani versus Hausa kind of thing. But what then happened was that at the height of banditry, at the height of cattle rustling, when it begins to transform into banditry, there were a lot of vigilante groups that emerged in those axes. In Hausa, they call them Ensakai, vigilante group, who will also organize and wage counter-violence on a particular group of people who happens also to be Fulani, and then kill them, including the innocent ones that were actually probably not part of that bandit formation or banditry formation. And then these ones who will reorganize and raid villages, kill people en masse, put fire on, set the entire village ablaze. So this is what has been going on. And the security forces, whether it's the police or it's the military, hasn't been that helpful. What we see is that once there is that huge escalation and there's a national outcry, we mobilize, send soldiers, send Air Force personnel, do some air raids, and sometimes some of those raids, sometimes with errors, and all that. I really, really think that while we commend the role that our soldiers are playing, and sometimes some of them are huge victims of this crisis, they get consumed. They are killed sometimes in their numbers, even if you look at what is happening in the Northeast. And now we are also beginning to see those kind of killings of soldiers and police, also even in the northwest of the country. This is recognized. But from where I sit, the security crisis we're dealing with in this axis is not necessarily a crisis of kinetic response. The kinetic response in terms of arms is important, but we really, really need to have a proper interpretation of what we are dealing with. One, the community issue that I talked about. Two, the sources of arms. Where are those arms actually coming from? We know where they are coming from, because the crisis is part of the larger Sahelian crisis. The whole Sahel is on the boil. Niger is not safe. It's a very important neighbor of over 2,000-kilometer border stretch. Some of them, or large portion of them, unmanned or unwoman. There are no forces around. Some of our forests actually had link with those borderlines. Number two, so if you take Niger, Burkina, northern Senegal, Mali, Chad, the whole of that Sahelian zone is actually on the boil. And therefore, the first dimension of the response actually have to be an international response. The armory of Libya was largely on the southern Libya. And by the time there is a total collapse of state in that axis, access to arms is just like one of the interviews I read of a repentant, in quote, bandit saying that it's like going to procure bread.
Exactly.
That's what he said.
I read that interview.
Yeah.
The leader of the group that abducted the Kankara boys,
yes.
he said that you get it anywhere.
It's just like going to buy bread. It's just like going to buy bread. So how did we get to a level where arms have become? They call bullets, they call it peanuts, or they call it beans, wake, or geta, in Hausa. That's what they do. You can easily move them. Our policing culture is outdated is very weak. It's not necessarily in terms of the number that we often refer to, but the culture itself is weak. Many times some of my friends, both in country and outside this country, ask me, how do you move 300 children without anybody seeing them? Of course, people see them. But what they carry, the kind of arms they control, is very overwhelming. And the kind of routes they take. Because if you look at this country, by the time you are passing the local government headquarters, you're probably not seeing any police anywhere. The military are not meant to actually even be everywhere. So once you can pass from one state to the other through this forest. And it's also very important for us to understand the history of this forest zone. Because over the years we have this forest, and some of them were created as far back as 1920s during the colonial rule. They were not necessarily created for environmental purposes. They were also created for the purpose of colonial management of people, of governance. The kind of settlement you have in the Sahel, and on that axis, whether or in the larger savannah, are dispersed settlement. The colonial system that we had in the country was an indirect rule where fewer colonial officers work with the existing political structure to govern people. There were few of them. So there were deliberate attempts to cluster people together. And so massive areas across the northern part of the country were designated forest reserves. The designation of forest reserve was one for governance purpose and secondly for environmental purpose. So when this designation emerges, it means that you cannot build a village in that area, you can't farm there, and you can't hunt there. That restricts you to certain areas of settlement. And then when you are restricted to those areas of settlement, the colonial authorities are able to access and actually been able to broadcast authority in those areas. So over the years, we haven't given a structured interpretations of it. Yes, in modern time, the environmental dimensions of it have come up. But we need to assess ourselves, do we really need them as they are at the moment? I believe in climate, the whole crisis of the climate. To some extent, I can say I'm an environmentalist. I would love to see environments protected, but I would also love to see safety and security. So can we assess, can we look at, do we need them? If we need them, what do we need them for? This is very important because they have a colonial history and sometimes their essence was sinister rather than actually progressive essence.
All right, we'll go on a short break, and when we return, we'll be looking at the role of state institutions, non-state actors, and in fact, individuals in helping to govern these ungoverned spaces that Dr. Abdu talks about. Stay with us. Thank you so much for staying with us, People, Politics, and Power. Dr. Hussaini Abdu is my guest, and of course, we're looking at the major challenges facing Nigeria today, almost on all fronts. And in the midst of all these big challenges, it appears that governance and those who have been elected and entrusted by the provisions of the Constitution to carry out these responsibilities are failing in their duties and responsibilities. One of the issues that has come up of late has been what many described as mudslinging between key office holders, key political office holders in Nigeria. So you see, for instance, a governor of a state, like we saw between the Benue State governor and the Bauchi State governor, between the Senate president and the governors of the Southwest, and all between senators and certain state governors. And many Nigerians think, look, we have a big fire that is threatening to consume the entire nation. And these people are, as it were, scratching for crickets.
Yeah, you know, this is my problem about this country. Our lack of capacity to respond to crisis. Every crisis has a narrative. And government has a responsibility to own at least one narrative. So what we have seen over these years is that the lack of capacity to develop their own narrative and use that narrative for strategic engagement. When we started facing the Boko Haram crisis, there was no one narrative. And I remember on several media engagement, my argument was the government need to have a narrative of what is causing the crisis, the dimension of the crisis, and its response to the crisis. You need a narrative to it. And that narrative must be collectively owned by every person in government and shared with citizens. And this is what we're experiencing now. There is no narrative. The government has any narration in terms of what is happening, no narration in terms of how it is manifesting, no narration in terms of its own response, and therefore different segments of the country, sometimes based on the country's fault lines, we are seeing different forms of narratives. So narratives makes us. The narrations we have defines us. And so if we are not able to provide the right one narrative, because it's still better you have a narrative and people disagree with your narrative, but you have something that you are hanging on to and that you collectively shared within the government. So it's not even between North and South, no, even within the North. Nasir El-Rufai had come out very clearly and disagreed with his colleagues in the Northwest in terms of how to respond to the issue of banditry around those states. His other state colleagues came back and even said that maybe he doesn't even understand. Gandu just said maybe Nasir doesn't even understand what the crisis is all about because he responded in Falgore in a very different way and almost the same way that Nasir is talking about. And this is what they did in that axis. Zamfara state government would say, no, for me, we have to go and negotiate. And that's the best way to deal with this, to deal with crisis. Because then I would say, look, we have negotiated before, they failed us, and I think that we need to go kinetic. And even today, as I was driving to AIT, I was listening to one of the radio stations, and I heard the governor of Zamfara saying that we know those who did this. We know them, and you'll be shocked if you hear their names or if you hear them, because they knew that we are making a lot of success in our response to this situation, and they are trying to sabotage me. And invariably for me, as a student of Nigerian politics, I know that he's referring to his opponents. That's basically what he's trying to say. Because if you know, then tell us who they are. And then you say that they are envious of the success that you have made. So it's basically saying that it's the opposition. And we are very quick to do that. And if we don't blame the opposition, we actually accuse them of escalation and all those things. So it's a failure to provide. So if you don't understand the problem, you are not able to interpret it. For me, I actually think that expecting the DSS, expecting the police, expecting the military to respond to this crisis, you probably may be exaggerating their capacity and strength. Or you probably don't actually understand what is going on. It is only in this country that security is made an exclusive preserve of security institutions. Security, for me, is a responsibility of all, but there can be experts who are not necessarily in security institutions. Civilians who have devoted their life to understanding the security issues. And this is what is done all over the world. At this moment, I probably expect the government to convene, even if it's a restricted national security conference, and that all you just have is one theme, national security, and bring people of different background, the media institutions, security agencies, political party, security experts, academics, and all of them come together, spend about a month, x-ray the different manifestations and character of our crisis, begin to find how to respond and set up mechanisms for that response. You also expect, in the process of building a single narrative, convening a National Security Council meeting. And in that National Security Council meeting, you get the right interpretations of it, and then governors and others who are members of it, we ask questions around that, and then you leave that council meeting with a common understanding of what the issue is. Even if you have your differences, you can resolve your differences in council, and then you go out there with a common understanding of how to respond. You probably also convene National Council of State meeting as part of the process of building a common narrative and drawing from the experiences of others to support you in dealing with this issue. But with due respect to the excellent, to the good job that some of our officers, people that we have trained, that we have paid to secure us are doing, but what we are dealing with is overwhelming. It's overwhelming. They need support, and the government must own up to that. And part of the process of owning up is convening a national security conference to actually have a conversation on national security. Yes, I can understand some of our viewers, some of our analysts will probably say, okay, national security conference is too narrow, and that maybe what we needed is a national conference. I don't have objection to national conference. I don't mind actually having a national conference. I think we should. But again, I know that convoking or instituting a national conference, now because of the politics, the political dimension that it often takes, it's not something you can have that easy within our current context. But you can, because security has become a major issue. You can convene a national conversation on national security. And you must make it a very inclusive conversation involving different segments of the country, including our senior political leader, governors, and all those things, so that we can talk to ourselves as a country and recognize that we are dealing with a big issue and find a way to address that
In
issue.
the wake of the Kagara abductions, you recall that the governor of Niger State, in fact, openly lamented that he wasn't getting enough support and from the federal government, enough assistance to get these abducted school children out. That again poses another problem. It speaks to the issue of a national narrative, a governmental narrative to this whole crisis.
Yeah.
Because what we have today is a situation of discordant voices.
Yes.
Even from the same Federal Executive Council,
Absolutely.
you hear different voices,
Yeah.
different reasonings and explanations
Yes.
for what is happening.
Yes.
When a state governor begins to lament that he's not getting the kind of support for the rescue of school children, a national security issue for that matter, what does that tell us?
Yeah, it just tells us clearly what I was trying to say earlier, that there is no strong coordinated approach to this crisis. There is no strong coordinated approach to it. It is one thing to say the state governors are chief security officers of their respective state, valid point by virtue of the constitution. But again, the major security institutions that can actually help the state governors to deliver and respond to this crisis are controlled by the center. So that's very important to recognize. So when a state governor is dealing with this kind of thing, he's working under significant pressure. And therefore, he needs strong pressure management. And it's only when he's seeing security agencies around to support that. But again, part of the crisis is that there is always a differential approach to crises of this nature between the state authorities and the federal authorities. So this federal authority says, for good or for bad, we're not going to negotiate and we're not going to pay any ransom. The state authority is probably not necessarily averse to negotiating, and negotiations sometimes, in most cases, will involve ransom.
Ransom, which is what is happening. The position of the federal government,
yes.
Given by what the president says,
yeah.
and that of Zamfara State,
yes.
Going by what the governor
yes.
of that state
yes.
is saying. One is saying, look, I want to dialogue, I'm
yeah.
granting amnesty,
yeah.
and this is the way I think we can
yeah.
resolve this.
Yeah.
But the federal government says, no, please don't give cash and other material resources to
yeah.
because it could embolden them
yeah.
to carry out.
Absolutely. And that's what we also saw even, because Part of the negotiation crisis that, as reported, was also that the bandit who kidnapped the boys in Kagara were demanding that some of their colleagues or counterparts who were arrested earlier should be released. So,
and there are reports that at least 4 of them may have been traded in for the children.
Exactly. So now the frustration of the Niger State government was the fact that the central government was reluctant to do that. That's the whole meaning of we are not getting the support. I also think that the government at the center has been very vacillative in terms of its response to Zamfara approach to this crisis. It doesn't come out firmly to state its position on this matter. Yes, some of us are aware that security agencies, whether it's DSS or the police or the military, do not support the idea of negotiating and paying ransom. But we're all aware that that is Zamfara State approach to it. But we haven't seen that strong, firm communication to Zamfara State government and say, look, we don't support this, and you should not do it. And if you do it, as far as we are concerned, no amnesty. Because if we get those people, we are going to grab them. So that's a strong message that you are not supporting. But when you don't do that, when Zamfara State government occasionally visits the president and gives the president feedback in terms of what is being done, and we are not seeing any disagreement emerging in terms of approach, then you go with the impression that the central government does not have any objection to that approach. I actually think that even if you are going to negotiate, even if you are going to pay bandit, as much as I don't support, ransom, as much as I don't support that, there should be a coherent approach to it. A more coherent approach to it, that people understand what actually is going on, and then how you negotiate, what message you should put on the table. But it is not something that you flippantly do just with anybody as an interlocutor. Negotiations involves interlocutors. Look, and they are strong, people are trained to be negotiators. It's always only in this country that you see this casual level of negotiation. You just pick anybody from the village.
Or anybody volunteers and
anybody
goes into the forest
and
to
goes
go and
into
talk.
the forest to just go and talk, like we are seeing with Malam Gumi, for instance. Oh, just said, I just need to go and talk to these people. And he just walked in. And he has conversations. It doesn't work. You must, because
conversations that do not have official sanction.
Yeah.
So how far can that go?
Yeah, on whose behalf
Yes.
are you actually doing this negotiation? On whose behalf are you doing it? The state governor was saying, Kaduna, Nasir was very clear that he disowned it. And you say nobody is negotiating for us because we are not negotiating with anybody. So for me, and then the Niger State governor has not shown any aversion, because he visited the Niger State governor in the course of going to some of the forests around Niger, and they had a conversation, and he was very clear, and he came out and he said he did. So for me, there is no proper coordination or coherence. You don't have a strong national narrative, and therefore you don't actually have a response.
Okay, very quickly, in 2 minutes, so that we can wrap this up. There is another aspect of all of these challenges that we face today, which is what Dr. Adewume Adesina, the AFDB president, talked about when he said Nigeria is practicing federalism rather than federalism. Again, it speaks to the whole issue of what the federal government should be doing and what the role of the state governments, who are constituent units, should be talking about.
Yeah, I think for me, I've had these conversations around our federal character, or the character of our federal system. I think federal federalism he means is that the central government is actually acting like a father and dishing out handouts and all that to state government, and is just almost ubiquitous. You find just the federal government practically everywhere, and for me, yes, it doesn't speak to the classic character of the federal system. It doesn't even suit our contemporary realities as a country. yes, we need to have a further discussion around how we want to manage our federal system. No system is perfect. There is no doubt about it. Every system is a work in progress, and there is no one single type of federal system that you say this is the one that must be federal. You learn from your context and your experiences and design what suits you. What we have does not suit us at the moment. We need the conversations to deal with that. It's very important. I think the years of military rule and the regimental and the hierarchical nature of the military structure impacted on our federal system. And we have seen that also informing the nature of even our federal constitution itself. But again, I think as a country, we have made very good progress in our federal system because, in our national conversations. I think the contention, those divisions around a certain limit of federal system, I think we are hearing common understanding of certain issues. And I believe that even if you convene the conversation, we may not go as rancorous as we used to be because some of the tendencies, even in the northern part of the country and even the southern part, we've heard. People talk about state police, and there is no, I don't think that there is much more debate around the state policing in the country at the moment. I think even in terms of resource management and control and all that, I think there has been significant progress in that conversation. So I think we need to talk as a country.
Right. So that conversation is important. It's key.
Absolutely.
Right. Dr. Hussaini Abdu is country director of CARE International, a political scientist, a civil society activist, and an intellectual of repute. Join us here on People, Politics, and Power. Join us again when we bring you a fresh edition of the program. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdu.
Thank you.
Your time.
Thanks for your time.
Bye for now.
Goodbye.